Welcome to the New Monastics podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics podcast. I'm Nathaniel Miles Yepes, co-founder of Charis Foundation and dialogue partner for our guests.
And I'm Daniel, the interviewer and host for the show.
Today we have my friend and fellow co-founder of Charis Foundation, Father Adam Bucko.
Adam has been a committed voice in the movement for the renewal of Christian Contemplative Spirituality and the growing New Monastic movement. He has taught Engaged Contemplative Spirituality in Europe and the United States, co-authored Occupy Spirituality and the New Monasticism, and authored Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation, the subject of today's show.
Committed to an integration of contemplation and sacred activism, Adam co-founded the award-winning nonprofit Reciprocity Foundation, where he spent 15 years working with homeless youth on the streets of New York City.
Adam currently serves as a director of the Center for Spiritual Imagination at the Episcopal Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City, New York, and is a member of the Community of the Incarnation, a new monastic community dedicated to democratizing the gifts of monastic spirituality.
Adam lives in New York with his wife, Kyra Jewel Lingo, a Buddhist teacher and former nun in the community of Thich Nhat Hanh. Together they lead the Buddhist Christian Community for Meditation and Action.
Welcome, Adam. We're so happy to have you here with us. Given that you've just released this new book, Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation, that's what we wanted to focus our dialogue on today. Having just read the book myself, I think it will be a great jumping off point for you to share with us some of your work and vision of spirituality. And just to begin, I was wondering if you could give us the elevator pitch, if you will, about the book. What was the inspiration and intention behind the writing of it and some of the reflections that are contained therein?
Well, thank you for having me, Daniel and Nathaniel. This is the first interview that I'm doing on the book, so I don't know that I have an elevator pitch that I have practiced. But the book is essentially a collection of reflections, sermons, and stories that were gathered into, this kind of a collection, I guess. And it sort of happened by accident, I would say. A lot of these were delivered as sermons, as talks during the pandemic, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So I was trying to respond to all the suffering that was present, especially in the New York City area. With ice trucks filled with bodies, we didn't necessarily know what was happening with this new virus. Then almost immediately after that, with the George Floyd tragedy. And so I was trying to speak to that in a pastoral way. Trying to offer people some kind of encouragement, utilizing some of the experiences that I've had in my life, working with people on the streets, but also other components of my spiritual formation. So that's kind of how the book happened. I was essentially asked by an editor from Orbis Books whether some of these talks could be published, and then I ended up, of course, rewriting many of them. But that was the inspiration.
So were a lot of the chapters contained in the book originally sermons delivered to your community?
Yeah, to my community and other communities. And at that point, of course, a lot of church was happening on Zoom because it was too dangerous to gather in person. Some of these also happened as individual conversations as we started, serving food to people on the streets, because a lot of people were losing jobs and all of a sudden didn't have access to proper resources. So that's how many of these chapters began. And then later on, I tried to give them a little bit more of a shape.
And that was an interesting time. We were talking on the phone at that time, actually on Zoom, and I remember you telling me, how bad it was in New York City at the time during the pandemic, and it was very interesting because here in Colorado, it's so open. People had the luxury of debating how bad it was and whether it was even real. But, when I was talking to you, when there are people dying in their apartments and people don't know that they've passed, and, and hospitals are overloaded, it was very clear that that was a luxury to believe that maybe this wasn't happening.
Yeah.
Which you didn't have in New York City.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember a few weeks into the pandemic, and I think we talked about it on the phone at that time. My community delivered some food to Brooklyn to our friend Juan Carlos, who's a former Roman Catholic priest, got in trouble. Now he's a Lutheran minister, got in trouble for wanting to do the right things, I should say. And he was serving a congregation of undocumented immigrants, largely from Mexico, where he's from. And he was essentially doing food deliveries because people were getting sick and etc. But I remember he was telling me how each week he would do like 30 funerals, and people who were undocumented were just dying in their apartments. They wouldn't go to the hospital because, of course, they were afraid in terms of consequences. As you know, at that time, also, there was a lot of anti-immigrant kind of public conversation going on. So it was a very scary time, and I'm glad that this book came together because, in some ways, even though it has a lot of stories from other periods of my life, I feel that in some ways, the way that it's put together, it kind of responds to what we're going through right now in terms of the pandemic, in terms of, our collapsing systems, in terms of just the general hopelessness that especially a lot of young people are feeling these days. The jobs they were promised are no longer there, and so how are we to move forward? And so I think this book, in a way, is my kind of small contribution to that conversation, not necessarily offering specific steps, but rather hopefully infusing the conversation with a certain kind of presence. I would hope spiritual presence that can help us to kind of reconsider some things.
Yeah, definitely. I can speak to the fact that it was just very touching on a personal level. I read it and it felt very resonant. And a lot of the stories that you told really drove home a lot of the points you were trying to make and gave them a lot of juiciness and depth, a lot of reality, because it is theology put into practice, not just talking about it. Very earthy, very down to earth in terms of helping people and putting the teachings, and even fairly simple teachings, into practice, but putting them into practice in extraordinary ways. And I think that leads just to the next question I wanted to ask, which is, the subtitle of the book is Lessons in Engaged Contemplation. Can you share with us a little bit what you mean by engaged contemplation and how you see that?
Yeah, so I think when I speak of engaged contemplation, I'm referring to an experience or a way of being that I discovered through working with young people struggling with homelessness in New York City. And what I mean by that is essentially this old teaching from Meister Eckhart, who said that all of us need to become mothers of God because God is always needing to be born. And so early on in my work, I had this experience, where I had my kind of some spiritual training, some therapeutic training, and I was working with young people, trying to like be the person who can show up and solve their problems or help them to solve their problems. And that wasn't really working. And then as I prayed about it, I realized that I need to show up for each person in a way that I show up for prayer. And how do I show up for prayer? I bring everything that is present in me and I place it in the presence of God and then just sit there in a state of receptivity and openness, in a state of curious not knowing. And then usually I get the sense that there's this, what I call the impulse of God, that kind of arises and takes whatever I bring and transforms it into something that can become useful, that can become my unique contribution. And so to me, engaged contemplation is about living our lives in this kind of a receptive way where we become a container into which the presence of God can descend, take whatever it is that we have, that we bring to this world, and transform it into something and then use it in the world. You know, essentially, as one of my old Sufi friends told me, you know, he said that his practice is about letting God live through him as much as possible. And I think that that's what engaged contemplation is. It's us becoming instruments. It's us letting God live through us, letting God love through us, sometimes letting God protest through us. So that's what I mean. And so I consciously, in a way, maybe stay away from words like spiritual activism and instead talk about this kind of more of a prayerful way of acting and being in the world.
That's nicely said. And I think this was prevalent during the period in which you were working on the book. There was a lot of talk of spiritual activism, and one critique I had was that it was straight activism, but being called spiritual, and there was no clear discernment about how spiritual would affect the means of activism. And so in some ways spirituality was being co-opted and damaged a little, in terms of reputation, by activism, which was justified, but perhaps sometimes not just. And what I wanted to say then was that the activism should come from the Spirit. And when it does, then it adjusts the kind of means that we use. And so, this kind of prayerful approach is I think where we should be in our ideals. And I note that it also defines your response. What you're doing in prayer is listening. That's an action. Accepting what is in terms of what's in front of you, with people, with situations, and then letting the response to what is come from that prayerful space. And so then there's a different type or possibility of action.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes, people assume that when you talk about this kind of a prayerful way of action in the world, that somehow that means that you need to be some kind of a checked out, spaced out, person, and that means that your activism will not have as much capability of naming, the evils that you might be engaging with in the world. That is not true. I mean, we look at people like Dr. King, we look at people like Dorothy Day or Catherine Doherty, or, the one that we lost not too long ago, Desmond Tutu. And we see that beautiful combination in them. I remember reading something about Desmond Tutu, how, he would spend a few hours a day in prayer, bringing all of the stuff that, he needed to act on into prayer, into that silence, and then showing up from that deep place. And so I think one of the points that I'm trying to make in the book that we do have to take time to do that. And that's why I call it engaged contemplation.
As Brenda shared with us last episode, times are urgent. We have to slow down. Something to that effect. And I think that captures, in some sense, what you're speaking to. And since you brought up Dorothy Day and Desmond Tutu, it leads to another curiosity I had in reading the book, is it seems quite clear that despite a lot of interspiritual, multi-faith influence, what you're speaking to is also a certain kind of lineage within Christianity, that lineage that is kind of represented by these great activist practitioners like Dr. King or Dorothy Day. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, if that feels resonant to your own experience and how you understand that. Another person I was thinking of reading the book is Greg Boyle, and his book Tattoos on the Heart. If anything, that's the book I've read before that felt most similar to your book.
Yeah, so I think that, in my own kind of personal spiritual journey, I have been influenced by people from many traditions. My childhood happened in Poland, and that was an initiation into a very specific kind of a spirituality that combined deep prayer with a lot of courage and a lot of protest, and all of that within a context of nonviolence. And so that really shaped me. At the same time, that school of Polish spirituality, I needed to leave that at some point, especially when the system changed and the church in Poland was trying to replace the Communist Party and take over and tell people who to vote for, or else they wouldn't, receive absolution when they go to confession and all that stuff. I mean, the church moved from being this kind of a motherly institution that held us with love and gave us courage to say no to injustice in the world. It moved from that into almost this kind of an abusive parent kind of a presence in our lives. So, when I was a teenager, even though I had this kind of a very deep experience in the church, I joined the anarchist youth movement and was not interested in the church. In fact, one of the first protests that I went to as a kid, once I was kind of making my own decisions, as a teenager, was against religion, meaning, classes taught by priests being taught in state high schools, because we felt that there needed to be separation. Even though we were all immersed in the Polish kind of school of spirituality, we felt that there needed to be a separation. So after that, I was only able to reconnect with that, not even so much the tradition, but that deep intuition of Christ's presence in my life through the mentorship that I've received from Hindu swamis and Buddhist monks and many other people from other traditions. I mean, I remember being still, I think, 19 and ending up at a Hindu monastery, and one of the swamis saying, this stuff that you're learning here is very nice, but you were born into a tradition that also has a deep mystical awareness. Read St. John of the Cross, go see Father Bede Griffiths in India, and etc. And so I think that in my life, all of that is somehow present. And I can function as a kind of a fairly traditional priest, but also can show up in settings that are not Christian, where it's more about just kind of translating what that tradition offers into a way of being with people that can support them on their journey towards, hearing that voice of the genuine, as Howard Thurman calls it, within their hearts, within their lives. But the book talks about many different spiritual figures, and there is a lineage. And the lineage is essentially all of those people who were deep contemplatives and also who acted in the world as a result of their prayer practice and etc. And I think that, one of the reasons why I'm in the church is because of those people, is because of the saints that this tradition produced. Because when I think about whom would I want to hang out with if I had a chance, it would be those people, So if this tradition was good for them, it's good for me, as I, hope to be going in the same direction as they did in terms of developing both the receptivity to God and openness to God, but also the courage to consent to God and what I am being called to. How am I being called to live, and serve and etc.
Yeah, what you're saying brings up two things for me. One is just your reflection on encountering other traditions and those traditions mirroring back to you in some sense what was to be found or discovered in your own tradition. Just sounds like such a beautiful possibility of interspirituality and of connecting. In a way, it's like the highest possibility for our encounters with another to help us better know ourselves, and ourselves could be our own tradition, etc.
Yeah, and I think maybe the distinction that I would want to make, that in the end it wasn't so much that those traditions helped me to see my tradition that I was born into, but rather gave me a new access to reconnect with the experience of God that my tradition gave me in my early years. But I think what it also did, it relativized how stuck or not stuck I want to be within my tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And then I just wanted to share what you were speaking to in terms of your youth, brought up this quote that I had pulled out because it moved me, and I just wanted to share it, which is, "The heroic priests of my youth," this is you, Adam, "the heroic priests of my youth in Poland protested totalitarianism because they knew that saying yes to God has to mean also saying no to everything in this world that violates God's love and justice."
Yes, I think that was the main lesson that I got, from them. And I think that, of course, this is me reflecting on it, some decades later. I don't know if that's what I knew as a child, but I think intuitively as a child, what I saw was that here were these people who seemed to be in touch with something bigger than what the state and the totalitarian regime or our own resources are offering us. They seem to be running on some kind of a different energy. They seem to be open to some kind of a power that, in our tradition we call God. And that means that they're showing up as a result of that. They're showing up in the world in a very specific way. And I think also that meant in some cases, especially the parish priest that we had in the parish where I was baptized, was that, the guy was killed, that there are consequences for that kind of a way of being. I mean, not all of us will be, killed, obviously, but it means that we have to take risks and that there will be consequences in terms of how the world responds to our actions. And that was terrifying for a child to realize.
I was reflecting on, we just spoke of a kind of lineage within Christianity of compassion and action. And I was reflecting that may not be a lineage as we might speak of it in some traditions as, passed from one hand to another. On the other hand, when one looks at Christian history, you see a constant tension of challenge. And the challenge comes from the example of Christ himself. And there's compassion and action throughout that exemplary life of Christ, where we see Christ demonstrate compassion and do something about it, with a particular person, and whether that is with regard to how that person is being judged and then taking care of them, or direct actions to heal or care for. That's an amazing exemplary example, and it infects the whole tradition so that it keeps echoing through the years, and you see tensions arise within the church where, when that is not being lived out, someone objects to the church not living up to its responsibility of compassion and action.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see this kind of contraction and expansion of protest over that and how we should be living in terms of a kind of imitatio Christi, an imitation of Christ. And I think that that's really the lineage that we're speaking of. That exemplary life is such that it makes a demand. If we're going to live in relationship to that exemplary life, then it's making a demand on us. And when our church gets away from it, there's a pullback, So I really feel that there's so much truth to what this lineage, but it's a through line,
Yeah.
and not so much a passed hand-to-hand lineage.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Nathaniel. That's so beautifully said. It's interesting, especially in Western Christianity, this question of lineage. I remember listening to one of the Merton's talks where he teaches his novices. And this was a talk on the history of monasticism. And for anyone who has not heard Merton, I think that's my favorite Merton, not so much, his books, but his speaking voice. It's like, sounds like it's someone you would want to have a beer with. I mean, I don't really drink, but I would do that, because he's just a fun guy to hang out with, And then once in a while, he just drops something on you that you're like, wow, like this was so profound. But he was making this very interesting statement that as monasticism developed and as it kind of moved from the East to the West, that Western monasticism made a decision. And the decision was that, in the East, a lot of it, especially in the early kind of period of desert fathers and mothers, it was basically you go to an elder and the elder instructs you, gives you a word of wisdom, and etc. But in the West, Merton says, that focus on an elder was actually replaced with a rule where the community became the elder, the community became the guru, and a norm of life was established, a norm of life that would give birth to a container that can kind of hold your spiritual life and move it forward. And that is very interesting because then as a result of that, I think in the West, this question of lineage looks differently. It's not necessarily that all of that is just kind of passed on from one elder to the next. Of course, that happens. But I think we have a lot of situations where people just rediscover things because the community and the rhythm and the rule of life and the sacraments create a container where that direct connection with the divine becomes possible again and again and again and again. And of course, we have lots of periods where that also doesn't seem to be present sometimes, where the church just gets lost as well.
Mm-hmm. I had a really interesting conversation with Father Thomas Keating around this. And by the time I was going to him as a young man, I'd really imbibed a lot of lineage talk and the clear idea that contemplative traditions are truly passed hand to hand, one-on-one between teachers. And it was occurring to me, and he brought it up clearly, that the monastic environment was itself a forming environment. and that he did not so much have, though we would consider him a spiritual master. And then, in that one way of thinking, well, there was a master before him that passed this kind of, but not so much. He said that the monastic environs, living according to the rule in the Cistercian way of life, that itself was a forming environment, which is to say there was a culture that was a container for a kind of spiritual growth, and the culture was functioning, the environment was functioning the way a teacher would. And then you're praying into that container and watching what grows in it. And that's different. And we have to make room for that understanding as well.
Beautifully said.
And for me, that brings up actually the very end of your book, Adam, where you have a section called On Being a Contemplative in the World, in which you share a broad series of practices for people who want to live as a contemplative in the world, or as you say, a new monastic. And so, given that we're kind of speaking about this tradition of Western monasticism, I'm wondering how you see this vision of engaged contemplation playing out for people who want to live as a new monastic, and what that could look like both within and without the Christian tradition.
Yeah, so I think what I do in that last chapter, I essentially offer something that could be adopted as a rule of life. And this is very similar, actually, to our new monastic community, the community of the Incarnation that was founded at the Cathedral of the Incarnation, here where I am today. And essentially what I'm trying to do in that chapter is to synthesize the contemplative approach, some of the new discoveries of psychology, and also different spiritual teachers who have engaged, with some of the new understandings of what it takes to actually move forward, and also the prophetic tradition. And so basically, the chapter, after I do my little introduction, talks about specific commitments. And it starts with a rhythm of life. And that really comes from Saint Benedict, where Benedict tells us that we should be living our lives in a way where we can listen to life, where we can listen to God with the ear of our hearts. So this kind of a receptive mode. And how do we do that? Well, in a Benedictine tradition, but really in all of the Christian monastic traditions, we adopt specific practices that help us to stop during the day and reconnect with that receptivity, reconnect with that sense of God's presence. And here I talk about a couple of different practices. One is a simple way of reconnecting with God through contemplative prayer and through a conversational prayer. Also, a way of paying attention to God's presence, which is a simple practice that comes from Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, which is really, we could say, a Christian or Carmelite mindfulness practice, and then also Examine, that was proposed to us by St. Ignatius of Loyola, where we look at our day through Christ's eyes to see where have we experienced God's presence, where have we missed an opportunity to do that, and etc. And that trains us again to be receptive and to be paying attention. Where is God's presence right now? How am I to respond to that, and etc. So that's the way of practice. That's the first component of what I'm proposing. The second one is that all of those practices really need to happen in the context of a community, because when we travel alone, we might talk about things like following the guidance of the Holy Spirit and etc. But, we can just mistaken that sometimes for the talk of our own minds, so to speak, and etc. And so the encouragement there is to find a small community, to start a small community, or to join a small new monastic community where you can learn how to be vulnerable with other people, where you can bring your experiences to the group, where you can learn how to ask for and and offer forgiveness with others, and etc. What we use in our community of the Incarnation, the methodology for what we call the ongoing conversion of life, is the 12 steps methodology from Alcoholics Anonymous. And we think that's a really wonderful method, and people like Father Thomas also felt that that can really be very helpful for people. And then, of course, another relational component that is needed is you need to be in spiritual direction and also, in my opinion, in psychotherapy. And this way you can avoid what sometimes is called spiritual bypass. Ensure that your development happens in a way that is well integrated and holistic. In addition to that, I also, then move into what does it mean then to live that kind of a spirituality in the context of serving the world. And that's when I give specific suggestions, what it means to serve. And I break down the service component or the activism component into a few different points. Number one, approach service not from an ideological perspective, but from a perspective of prayer, because that helps you to prevent othering. And contemplative prayer gives you a sense of interconnectedness of all people and on life in God. So as a result of that, you approach people differently. You don't just want to dehumanize them and etc. Then I talk about personal shifts that we can make. These days we complain a lot about the American empire. Well, it matters what kind of choices we make in our lives. As Arundhati Roy says, you're not happy with the empire? You can starve it. Stop buying what they're selling, right? And so we can make individual choices where we get our food, how we spend our money, and etc. Then the next component of service and activism is make sure that your hands are touching the hands of someone who is suffering. I think it's absolutely important to have that direct contact with those who are suffering. And that also, I would include in that Mother Earth, And then finally, direct service and personal choices and all of that, it's not enough because all of that, our lives and our relationships exist within the context of institutions that have their own logic. And that's why I'm also encouraging people to discern what movement they want to be engaged in and to get engaged in a movement that is trying to affect the structures of our society as well. So I think through that, I'm trying to offer basically a way to begin this journey towards what the book calls engaged contemplation, where prayer and action meet, but also where action becomes prayer, not just is something that is related to prayer.
Mm-hmm. If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening.
I'm reminded that back when we met around 2012, you were so much active in Reciprocity Foundation, which you co-founded. And so your daily activity was really the work of Reciprocity Foundation, that direct action work with kids off of the street and being with them on the street. And so, one would suppose that all your reading is this kind of activist reading, but it was obvious all your reading was on prayer. Almost everything that you were reading in those days was on prayer. And, whether it was Henry Nouwen or whoever,
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting to help our understanding around this to know that the diet that you're feeding yourself is critically important. And it's not this kind of one-to-one thing, like, oh, I want to do, engaged contemplation. And so it's all on the doing, and that's what all my reading and inspiration is going to be about. Your inspiration may come elsewhere.
Yeah.
And in making it contemplative, I think meant that all your reading was on prayer and the development of your prayer life, especially as a resource.
Yeah, I mean, I was very active, and so I needed to make sure that my mornings were quiet. I always had some kind of a spiritual resource, a book that spoke to my heart and helped me to reconnect with a sense of God in my life and helped me to reorient my mind and my heart. I think that that is very important. And yet, I was educating myself about youth homelessness and different strategic issues that were present. But that spiritual reading was really a big part of my spiritual practice, where every day I made sure that I had time to practice, but also that I always had something with me, a little book that could remind me or help me to reconnect with that sense of God's presence. Because sometimes it's hard. It's so easy to lose that, especially when we are very engaged, with the world and etc. And I think that this is maybe one of the difficulties that I'm observing right now in different, activists who sometimes, come to me for spiritual direction, is that somehow a lot of other things are replacing that practice of reconnecting with the divine. And I think it's absolutely important to be educated about, social systems and etc. I mean, I spent years doing that, and I had some wonderful mentors in graduate school. I mean, that's what I studied, social movements in graduate school before I was trained for priesthood. But I think we should never forget that if we are on this journey of engaged contemplation, we need to take time to actually practice, not just to talk about practicing or thinking that other things can substitute that practice. And again, I'm not talking about disconnecting from the world and, becoming some kind of, I don't know, a bliss bunny, and check out and think that everything is, hearts and flowers. No, but it's really our practice that can help us to face the world, to experience our heartbreak as we are facing the world, and then to sit in that space and wait in expectation that something of God will come and whisper to us, how are we to respond to that? And we need practice for that. And I think that, I hope that it comes through in this book that is very important.
Well, that's something we have to consider all of the time, especially when we're motivated by compassion. It's almost a truism now. When I was a therapist, I might say, you can only give from a full cup, If the function of that cup is to pour, and if it allows you to transfer something to another person, well, the cup better be full. And if you're the cup, you pour out, how do you get full again? We have to spend some time cultivating the good that we give. So I think that that's important all around. But I think the sense of urgency that we feel often has us tipping the cup, and the last drop is dropped out, and you feel like you can't stop. But you're no longer serving at this point because there's not much to give, and the quality of what's given is diminishing. And so I think we do have to go and spend time gathering what is to be given. And I think that that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah, and my wife tells a beautiful story about her teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, when she was a nun on September 11, 2001. All the monastics were on the bus going to a lecture somewhere where Tai, her teacher, was going to speak. And then they found out about what had just happened. And immediately, they started thinking about how the community is going to respond, whether they should be sending out, a press release and gathering people for from some kind of a mindful way of processing. And it was interesting how her teacher responded to that. He said, "No, today let's go to the beach and let's spend a few hours swimming, talking, nourishing ourselves, being a community, loving each other, and then we begin the work tomorrow." And I think that is just such a wonderful model for what we're trying to say, you know?
Yeah, this topic is touching into something that felt really important in the book, which is a certain kind of orientation towards service, which I think is important because I think it can be easy for quote unquote service work to become somewhat arrogant or build up an identity of, I am the person who helps other people. And in your book, you return time and time again to that sense and reflection of, while you were helping and serving, you were also being helped and served. And that the orientation towards prayer created a situation where there was space for grace, and there was seemingly a lot of absence of this kind of arrogance that I'm talking about, because there's the understanding of powerlessness and hopelessness, and maybe even your own sense of overwhelm at facing, when we're talking about the Reciprocity Foundation, facing this crisis of youth homelessness in New York City, and seeing how in a lot of external ways, the problem wasn't being solved, and maybe didn't have the problem to quote unquote solve it. And that your response to that was showing up in a prayerful way. And that seems like a really important dimension of this engaged contemplation. So I don't know if that feels fair, but I'm curious if that is resonant in terms of what you were trying to speak to.
Can I read maybe a passage from the book that responds to that?
Absolutely. That'd be great.
So this is a passage that kind of directly talks about this. And I alluded to this earlier in our conversation, but let me just maybe read this. It's from a chapter called Claiming Our Irrelevance. I spent years building skills and learning tools, and in the process felt that I would become a capable professional, armed with therapeutic skills and techniques that could fix people's lives. Deep down, I really believed that I was there among the homeless fixing their lives. Until one day I realized that what I was doing was not really working. Kids were going through our programs and still ending up on the streets. Kids were going through our programs and they were still just one step from being hurt or even killed by a drug dealer or pimp. That is when I was forced to change. I started feeling helpless and my confidence was shattered. All that I was left with was faith. All that I was left with was trust that I was where God was calling me to be. As a result of the crisis I underwent, my work evolved from a highly praised, solution-oriented, and evidence-based practice into something much more intuitive. It really moved into prayer. And when I say prayer, I don't necessarily mean that I was saying prayers with people. Instead, I started showing up for every person who needed my help in the same way that I was showing up for prayer, gathering all my knowledge and tools and entrusting them to God, saying to God, I think you're calling me to do something here. This is what I come with. I offer it to you. Take it, change it, make it useful, because I feel so small and useless here. I would just be there with homeless youth in a state of not knowing and trust, paying attention to what was, bearing witness to their pain, helping them to hold their pain, and often breaking with them as a result of what I was witnessing. How could I not break to hear all the stories of abuse they experienced? How could I not break hearing about all the violence and hurt? And what I began discovering is that every time I allowed myself to feel at a loss in the face of the pain I witnessed, every time I touched my own irrelevance, there was this energy of God that would begin to emerge in our midst. All I had to do was say yes to it. The presence of God was there, always ready to pick up the broken pieces from the floor and reassemble them into something good, into something wholesome. And when that happened, I realized that my skills were not useless. I just needed to first surrender them to God, so God could use them however God wished. So right words could come, so right ways of being present could manifest. And when that happened, it was often not clear who was helping whom, because in each of those sacred moments I received just as much as I was giving, if not more. And then later on, I also say something about Mother Teresa. I say, I think this is how God works. In moments when we take honest stock of our lives and simply surrender who we are and what we have to God, no matter how useless, God becomes the actor who acts through us. God becomes the writer of our lives, and we become a pencil with which God writes a love letter to the world. That is how Mother Teresa used to put it, and she understood it so very well. So I think that kind of, in a way, summarizes what we're trying to name here, touching our own irrelevance so God could be, what's relevant in us.
Yeah, so thank you for that. That quote from the book really beautifully captures it. And as we've been talking about things somewhat more theoretically, or the vision of it, I just wanted to ask if there was one of the anecdotes from the book that you'd like to share, because so many touching stories. And I think, as I said earlier, it feels like it's the stories that really ground the contemplative vision and theology and make it really hit home. Like, you can see the examples. It's not floofy, and it doesn't feel floofy because it's right in front of your face. And so I'm just wondering if any of those stories, I know a lot of the stories you share are difficult stories, and so I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing any of those in this context, but if you would, it'd be beautiful to just hear one of those examples.
Yeah, maybe I will start with one of the first stories that I shared in the book. It's a story that comes from a retreat. Sometimes the Reciprocity Foundation takes young people on retreats, people who normally stay in shelters or are living in the streets. And over the years, we've taken kids to many different retreat centers and monasteries. And so this story comes from one of those experiences. I was co-facilitating one of those retreats with my co-founder, Taslim Tagore, and she was doing most of the teaching on that retreat, and I was seeing young people for one-on-one spiritual direction. And this happened actually at Omega Institute in upstate New York. I would sit outside of their little chapel or a temple that they have on the hill. And it's very beautiful when you sit outside. There's some water and flowers. And so I would sit there, and once in a while, a young person would come by to do a session of spiritual direction. And this one young person came, and we talked and we prayed, and she was having difficulties really kind of naming or giving words to something that was clearly going on for her internally, for some of the things that were coming up as a result of the retreat. And so my instruction for her was to go for like a 10-minute walk, a meditative walk around the chapel, to go into the woods and to find 3 objects that could kind of capture the state of her heart. And she came back with three objects, and we sat and talked. And one of the objects was a flower that had yet to bloom, it's kind of a closed little flower. And she told me that she felt like that flower, she felt like there was a gift inside of her that perhaps one day maybe will emerge, but that no one knew, and that even she had really forgotten that that is the case. But this retreat was kind of helping her to see that maybe there is something there worth trusting. Maybe there is a gift that she carries that perhaps one day could bloom. And we talked about it, and it was a very kind of, in many ways, difficult and heartbreaking conversation, as she had a sense that there was something that felt completely cut off from that. The pain of her past just really prevented her from accessing that somehow, or even fully trusting that. And so after the conversation, and I felt sort of like I didn't do much there, I suggested that maybe she should just go into the chapel and to hold these objects and spend some time praying and meditating. And that's what she did. She went in, and that was my last appointment for the day. So I was, I went to the cafe that beautiful campus has. I got some tea, sat outside, and was, kind of reflecting on my day. And sometime later, I see this girl running forward, running and running and running. And she was like, look at this flower. And I was like, yeah, it's very beautiful. But I didn't feel there was anything unusual. That campus had many flowers, so, and she said, no, it's the same flower that I had and that we talked about. And she said, I went into the chapel, I placed the objects on my palms, I closed my eyes, and I just prayed and meditated. And when I was doing that, something just shifted, and I feel like my fears and my sense of isolation just dissolved, and there was this sense of peace that came over me. And then I opened my eyes, and I saw that the flower had bloomed when I meditated. And it was very touching because, I don't know what happened with that flower, but for her, it was such a sign. And years later, when we talked, she calls it her flower meditation. She said that was really a turning point for her, that somehow that experience gave her courage to say yes to something that she now knew was very real. And also it gave her courage to face the world that wasn't always on her side, and to just be free to be who she is. So that was a really beautiful experience for me, because every time you see that something is happening in those moments of grace, I don't know, to me, that's also kind of an encouragement, from the Spirit, that we're going in the right direction here. We're moving towards, towards that place of receptivity and consent to God. So, that's the story that I open with. And I tell this story, and this was originally a sermon that happened just a couple of weeks after George Floyd was murdered. And I connected to some Hebrew Bible teachings, and also to James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, in terms of how our inner dignity, how it's connected to justice, and how we can't stay human unless we oppose the structures that are forcing us, or forcing specific groups of people into situations that are inhuman, that are unjust.
Something interesting to me there is, she had an experience like many people had in life, And many of the other kids that were in the program would have had similar stories, perhaps. And even the realization that I haven't bloomed. We might have that realization too. And the understanding that I'm not where I should be. I'm not what I could be yet. I feel stuck. I know that there's something that is possible for me. And even that is common enough. But I think what's interesting here is taking that into prayer, taking that into meditation. She took that awareness of the unbloomed flower and took that into the prayer space. And without that act, it doesn't necessarily bloom. Like, yes, we don't know what happened with the flower, and what the causes and conditions were to allow that to bloom. But I think we do know that without this next act of taking our awareness into a prayer space, it may not happen. Okay, so she has the realization that, oh, I haven't bloomed, and this is symbolic of that. And she has that conversation with you, but there's maybe no next thing, and she leaves that somewhere, and she never sees it bloom. Or doesn't continue that meditation. So I think there's something important about moving to that next step. It's not enough to have the one realization. We have to continue the prayer process. And process is the right word because it's an ongoing back and forth between awarenesses and receptivity of going into prayer space and the new awarenesses. And so it just occurred to me that at any given moment, she could have set that flower down somewhere and walked away from it and not continued a process around it. So that seems very important to me.
And I think that in some ways, this is what I'm trying to get at with this book. We are facing something as a human family. It's the world that some people would call, like the global dark night. And a lot of our solutions are probably coming from the same mindset that created these problems in the first place. And so perhaps right now, it's time to do something different. And maybe related to what you said, Nathaniel, I just maybe wanted to conclude with another quote from the book that I think really speaks exactly to what you just said and how beautifully you framed it. I mean, thank you for that insight. And this is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it comes from the chapter called Our Global Dark Night. And this quote, this teaching, happened on right before the famous Montgomery event on January 27, 1956, right before the bus boycott. And it basically talks about the situation that after receiving an anonymous phone call saying to Dr. King, leave Montgomery immediately if you have no wish to die, he just really got frightened. He hung up the phone, walked to his kitchen, and with trembling hands, as he said, put on a pot of coffee and sank into a chair at his kitchen table. And this is how he described what happened. And again, it's this helplessness, it's this bringing it into prayer. So he sat on that chair by the kitchen table and he said, and these are his words, I was ready to give up with my cup of coffee sitting untouched before me. I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In this state of exhaustion, when my courage had all but gone, I decided to take my problem to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed aloud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I said, I am here, taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership. And if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. And then he continues, and at that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced God before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. Almost at once, my fears began to go. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. And I think that, this is what we're talking about, more or less, both in our own lives, as well as, with all of the problems that we as a human family are facing right now.
Beautiful. I just wanted to reflect the story you shared about the flower and also this reflection from Dr. King. I think just speaks so powerfully to the fact that the healing we need as individuals, as communities, as a planet is not just material, but also spiritual, and the ways in which the material and spiritual are inseparable, and how we really need to heal and love on all of those different dimensions to enact, hopefully, a new, more positive manifestation for the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautifully said.
And so I just wanted to thank you, Adam, for joining us today. For our listeners, the book title again is Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation. And that's just out as this episode is coming out. It will have been released just for a couple weeks. And so Adam doesn't have to do any self-promotion. I will give it 5 stars. Highly, highly, highly recommend it. I'm not just gassing him up. I was really moved reading it. And so with that said, Nathaniel, do you have anything you'd like to say before we close?
No, I did just think it would be interesting. For so many years, you were doing such intense direct work, and it was taxing on you, and that was your work with Reciprocity Foundation. And then over the years, the call came to become a priest, and you followed that call, and for your friends, we thought, wow, that's so on point. That was always true and now needs to be made manifest. And I think it would be, now you function as a priest with the Cathedral of the Incarnation, and I think it would be interesting to people to know how you continue to serve in terms of engaged contemplation, because maybe some people assumed you move from reciprocity and doing that direct action, and then move now into the church, and now it's all contemplation. There's a balance point for you, and maybe you could just say a little bit about that before we close.
Yeah, so the calling to priesthood really kind of reemerged, I felt that calling as a child. It was often this kind of a secret that I was carrying in my heart, but it took a lot of courage to start naming it. And yet I knew that unless I say yes to it, something very fundamental about who I need to be will be missed. And so I'm very grateful that I was able to say yes, and that I received so much support from my bishop and from all the people who accompanied me, and also from my friends, including you, Nathaniel. And right now, I function as a priest, which means that, every Sunday I say masses. I'm part of a new monastic community that prays daily, twice a day together online, as it's a dispersed community with people all over the country, and also sometimes in other countries. But it's not just all contemplation. I also serve on the streets, feeding people. I also do chaplaincy and teach people contemplative prayer at a local jail. I also still mentor homeless youth and also college students and some young activists. So in many ways, that work is continuing. It's just now, I think, something shifted in a sense that I no longer have to be shy about the spiritual foundation of this work. And it's not like I was before, but, functioning within the nonprofit industrial complex, sometimes the funding community is interested in specific outcomes like jobs for homeless youth, but is failing to acknowledge the need for the spiritual transformation that needs to take place before someone can function in the world in a way that is wholesome, in a way that is healthy, And so I think that some of that work I'm happy to claim in a different way.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just to close us out, Adam, do you have anything like a poem or prayer that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I would like to share a poem which I tend to treat as a prayer.
Beautiful.
And it's from Dorothy Solle, a German mystic and liberation theologian who taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York for many years. And this is called Dream Me, God. Dream me, God. It's not you who should solve my problems, God, but I, yours, God of the asylum seekers. It's not you who should feed the hungry, but I who should protect your children from the terror of the banks and armies. It's not you who should make room for the refugees, but I who should receive you, hardly hidden God of the desolate. You dreamed me, God, practicing walking upright and learning to kneel down, more beautiful than I am now, happier than I dare to be, freer than our country allows. Don't stop dreaming me, God, because I don't want to stop remembering that I am your tree planted by the streams of living water. Amen.
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 Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.